So hi, everyone. Welcome to the Clearview Chamber of Commerce workshop. Tonight, we have Wendy with us. She is going to talk with us about, she's a human resource specialist. Did I say that right, Wendy?
Yes, you did. Yeah.
And she's going to share the latest and greatest with us. So, of course, I want to make mention of the Small Business Enterprise Center in Collingwood, who sponsors these workshops once per month and gets to, and that is helps us support and promote our small businesses in the chamber. So Wendy, whenever you're ready, you go ahead.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to be here this evening. I know we have a fairly small group at the moment, so I will go through the material that I have, but I do want to try and make it as interactive as we can, given that we're on Zoom, and sometimes that can be a little bit challenging. So I do want to get through the material and share sort of my thoughts with you guys here online, and then open it up, right? And answer any other questions. If there are things that I don't cover off that you want to talk about, I'm happy to do that as we go through it. So just by way of sort of a bit of an introduction about a little bit more about myself, I'm going to talk a little bit about my business, HR Annex Consulting, and give a little bit of background in terms of the thinking that I put behind these materials and this information to share with you. I'm going to talk a little bit then about sort of what got you here and talk about the planning piece. What I see a lot of times when I consult with clients is they get themselves into this kind of loop scenario where, let's say, for example, they have so much on their plate, they know they need to hand the work off, but it's really difficult to go out and recruit or to be able to delegate tasks, and then they get themselves into kind of that looping sort of scenario. So we're going to talk a little bit about the planning. And then I'm going to talk also about, from my perspective and what I've learned in business, and again, I'll share a little bit more about my background, what I would say businesses should focus on and when they should do that, as part of kind of protecting that investment that you make in people, right? So when you start bringing people into your business without knowing everybody's, business size, that's can be a significant portion of your expense or your operating cost, right? In terms of paying out payroll and things like that. And then I'm going to talk about some key takeaways. So a little bit more about myself. I've been in HR now for over 25 years. I've been in large corporate businesses. I've worked everywhere from the management board. I've worked on the shop floor. I've been in manufacturing facilities in different industries. And I think, my learning is I've worked in businesses that have been everywhere from startups right the way through to what we would call renewal or declining businesses or more mature businesses. And so the nature of those businesses in terms of what's happening differs at each stage. And so I think from a people management perspective, some of where you need to focus will also differ a little bit. And the idea behind this today is just things you can do to kind of keep building up your people management strategy or plans to support your business, whatever cycle or whatever stage you're in the business. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, share some lessons learned as we go. I've had a lot of them and a lot of discussions with different companies and different managers. So by all means, pick my brains. If there's things that you've got burning on the plate, let me know. We can kind of talk through those as well. But essentially, my focus is helping business basically manage the business of people. And that's everything from a new hire right the way through to an individual that you may be looking to, move out, retire, they're leaving the business. So it's everything in that employee cycle as well. So two sort of key concepts that I wanted to share with you in terms of how I set up the slides and what I wanted to talk to tonight is that basically businesses and people move through different stages of development over time. So I don't think I'm, if you think of your own experience, from a new hire or a new grad, through to a more mature business professional, what you need at each stage of your development changes. It's the same in a business. What a startup company is going through is not the same as a mature or more stabilized business. And so as a result, where we tend to focus from an HR perspective shifts a little bit as well. So those needs change, right, at each stage of development. And what's the priority and what's focused changes over time. And I think the other piece that I want to throw out there is sort of what got you here isn't going to necessarily get you there. So when you look at your business in terms of where you are today and where you're planning to be, you may need to, from a people perspective, look at, for example, skills and capabilities, right? What you needed in the early stages versus, what you're seeing in your business may need to change. And so it's being ready with, with the right person or the right tools at the right time. So in terms of the business life cycle, I'm going to see if I can just move this over here for 1 second because it's covering up my slide a little bit. So you may be familiar with this. There's lots of different models. I like to keep, when I share models and information, fairly simple. So this is as simple as I think you can get it. Businesses typically go through these 4 life cycle stages. So a startup tends to be very innovative, very experimental. You have very small team members. It could be one person, it could be a couple of people. There's a lot of high risk and there's a lot of in the moment. When I've worked with startups, they're very mavericky. There's not a lot of structure. There's not a lot of, in some cases, controls, particularly when I think about businesses that get acquired and brought into larger corporations and they're trying to integrate. And there's a lot of things that should be in place, aren't in place, but that's the beauty of why you bought the startup and why you brought it into your organization, but it can have its own challenges. And so it's a very unique environment. And I would also say that the people that I've met and worked with in a startup environment are in a sense unique as well. Everybody's unique, but I mean, these are folks that like that sort of mavericky, no structure, limited structure kind of environment. And people are wearing a lot of different hats. So if your business is in that stage, then you're hoping to get out of it. I mean, that is where you need to start thinking early about the changes you need to make in terms of your organization, right? And people that support that. The next stage businesses tend to go through, if they're continuing, is in growth. You get a lot more planning focused in that type of environment. There's higher profitability. You're starting to get some stability happening. You're reinvesting. You're starting to define roles and responsibilities for people. You're getting more of an organizational structure there. Okay, so I'm giving you some high level points. I'm not drilling down into everything, but just trying to illustrate, if you're in a startup mode and you're living it right now, very entrepreneurial, very mavericky, not an awful lot of structure. And that translates into some of the people plans and strategies you would have. And then as you go into growth, same thing. Then the business will go into what they call, maturity. You have an established brand, an established name in the marketplace. You've got steady growth. There's a lot more predictability. And the companies there that I've worked with tend to be very much on the continuous improvement aspect of it. They may even be into acquisition and merger type scenarios, but essentially they're very well established. So a lot of their systems, business systems, and as a result, people systems are well defined and in place, right? But it doesn't mean that if you're in the earlier stages that you can't start to think and start to build those things out. And that's really the point. If you start to think about those, you look at the sort of roadmap for your business, if you have one, and where you think you're likely to hit that next stage, it's starting to do some of that upfront planning. And then we get to the last stage in a business, which again, I've been in these businesses as well. They call them sort of renewal or decline. Those organizations are looking potentially at sort of branding refreshes. They're looking at adjacent channels. They might be looking at divestiture, M&A, or which is merger and acquisition. They could be looking at new markets. I mean, one example, for a large company that people may be familiar with is the kind of Kodak story, right? Which is very well established organization, very much a leader in their space. They're in the sort of photographic market, but new technology came in and knocked them right out. And basically, there's lessons learned as well, even though they had a very successful, very mature business, that, there is still some potential risk. So, I'm not here to analyze Kodak, but just to show that, that renewal can hit very well established, organizations and push them even into decline type scenario. So again, the strategies you have around people, you need to think about that. the other thing I would say, some of those businesses, when you get to that end, you could also be looking at succession planning and who's going to take that business over, or how are you going to hand that business off when you're getting into that stage. So the reason I share this is I tend to look at HR tied into the business life cycle stages, and I'll talk about kind of the things that you could be looking at as your business goes through that, to be part of kind of a proactive planning approach. So I'm going to share as well another quick slide. Again, there's lots of different models out there, keeping it really simple. So the employee life cycle, it's not a direct tie-in or correlation to the previous slide. But you could say that your recruit is kind of your new hire. You know, they're getting up to speed, they're learning everything. You've got to look at onboarding, okay, developing your talent. You get into the retention piece and offboarding. So I'll come back to each of those. So those are kind of the broad stroke areas of the employee life cycle. So of course, when you're in the recruiting phase, you know, critical to identify the, you know, and source the right skills and capabilities. And also who you're hiring for what stage your business is at. I will tell you that in my experience, individuals that are hired into startups like that environment. For example, they love the kind of lack of structure and the autonomy and the freedom for decision making. They may or may not do as well in a more mature, more stable environment. They like the startup environment. So it's also being aware of where your business is or where it's going to in its life cycle when you perhaps are looking at your recruiting, amongst other things, right? Am I hiring? Are we going to hit the next stage? Should I be looking at people that are going to bring some different skill sets or experience to the table? Then obviously we have onboarding. And here is where I think businesses, you know, do a reasonable job, but I do hear from companies, you know, when a new hire starts, it's kind of, they get thrown in at the deep end. So it's sort of a sink or swim, you know, and the better businesses can be at onboarding a new employee. So that's really setting them up for success right from the start. Giving them clearly defined expectations, making sure they have all the tools they need. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but essentially, you know, you can, when you think of it as an investment, you know, the amount of time and energy it took you to go and recruit that person, bring them into your company, pay whatever salary you need to pay, whatever other resources you needed to help set that person up, there could be quite a bit of money tied into that new hire. And if you don't onboard them in a manner that sets them up for success sort of from day one, then you could potentially lose on that investment, right? You're not getting them up to speed fast enough so they can't contribute, and or they could walk, right? I mean, that's kind of your two extremes. When we talk about developing somebody, you know, here we're talking about focus on building skill and capability. You're starting to look at that future potential. You're starting to look at, you know, possible career path or career development. You're starting to build out your organization in terms of developing, you know, next level capability, either for position or for the business. When you're looking at developing in the retain section, this is really, again, where you want to be focused on the culture, creating the right work environment, making sure you're getting high levels of employee engagement in order to retain that asset. And again, look at people not to take away from the fact that they're a person, but they are an asset to your business. And again, by the time you're getting into sort of 2-3 years down the road, you know, you really are dealing with potentially, you know, a lot of money invested in that person. And that's really what you're wanting to focus on. And then the offboarding would be the last stage of that employee life cycle. If you think about somebody's career, I'm recruited, I've been brought up to speed, I've been developed, I've had opportunities to grow, you know, I'm happy to remain within the organization. Offboarding is just as important, doing that successfully, as onboarding somebody. So offboarding would talk about transitioning them out of the organization, and that's not a negative. It could be for a variety of reasons, retirement, or they're just leaving the organization. but you would want to take a look at how you offboard somebody and make sure that you do a good job. I'll give you an example. If you've had a very long-standing employee, in fact, I was talking to a client the other day there about this. Somebody who's been in the business for a long time has a lot of what we call tribal knowledge, right? They know a lot about the business, they've got a lot of insight. And so when you lose potentially one of those employees, and let's take, the example of retirement, what are you doing to make sure there's a good transfer of knowledge to perhaps other people in the organization that will pick up the work this person is doing? So the onboarding and the offboarding pieces are two areas as well that we talk about from an HR and a people management perspective. And again, without knowing everybody's business online, you could have a lot of these things in place, which is great. So it's either just a refresher or reminder, or it could be an opportunity to say, hey, that's something I need to look at in my business as I go forward. So I've talked earlier about protecting your investment. And again, if you think about your own business or even your own personal experience, how much time and money a company put into you, right? Or you've put into your staff, then it really is making sure that, if you can get the basics right, if you can plan, if you can think through and anticipate some of these things that might start to happen in your business as your business develops, then you're bringing your people along with that, and you can sort of expand some of those systems and process, as your business matures, and making sure that you're kind of tying in the people needs with what your business needs are at the same time. The other thing I like to say, just to put it into perspective, this is another conversation I have with businesses. If you don't take some of the time up front to think through some of these processes or business needs that you have and people needs that you might have, and be sort of a little more proactive, then some days it's going to feel like you're trying to put air in the tires as you're going down the 400. It's not easy, right? So I've talked with businesses around job descriptions, for example, and we need to clarify people's job descriptions. We need to make sure they're clear on what their roles and responsibilities are. Well, they never had any at the beginning. Now they're having to sort of sit down and start to write it. Or I'll use an example of work instructions or policies and procedures. Again, when you're in the thick of it in business and you've now got to take some time out and sit down and start to map this stuff out, it's time that perhaps, if you sort of thought earlier and could be more proactive, you could potentially save yourself a little bit of time. And again, it goes back into that investment piece, right? Helping make sure that you're keeping people motivated and engaged, in the business with the right tools. So the next section here, I wanted to just talk to, and again, with a limited number on the call, I'm happy to entertain any questions as we go as well. I'm kind of calling it what got you here. I mean, a conversation, as I've said earlier, that I do have with organizations is wanting or thinking they can, in a sense, do the same thing they've always done and they'll get a different result, right? Or it's always worked for us. We don't know why it's not working now, but boy, that's a lot of work for us to make a change. And the reality is, well, something's going to have to give, because again, if you think back to that business cycle, what you're having to do when you're in a startup versus what you do as a mature business, so you want to expand into other markets, I mean, it's a different mindset, it's a different skill set, it may be different technology, different systems, and that all has an impact and a knock-on effect to the business, to the organization and people, right? So this was really just intended to be things to think about, and these are based on sort of conversations I've had. There's a lot more to this, but I think one of the conversations I have is around getting that good organizational fit. So the right person in the right job, and the other piece I add in is at the right time, right? If you hire, I was just even interviewing today with a client for a position they're hiring for, and we're starting to see candidates. And there was clearly a candidate today, excellent individual, but they were well down the path. They would have been somebody that we would have said, this person really looks like they're more into that mature strategic type business. This is still finding its feet. This may or may not be the right fit for that person at this time. Are they a great Potential resource? Absolutely. But is this the right position? You know, we talk about overhiring, underhiring, and I think it's more a question of, as a business owner or business leader, where are you prepared to invest your time, right? Because you can, to some extent, certainly develop people's technical skill sets. And we talk about the organizational fit, which can be that sort of mindset and some of those other capabilities that may or may not be as easy to develop, like that entrepreneurial spirit type concept, right? So getting a good organizational fit and spending some time doing that correctly pays out, you know, longer term from a business perspective than just, I'll hire somebody. I had a client, it's like, we hire them and it's almost like I put a body in a position and we'll make it work. It doesn't work. And you end up spending a lot of time and effort where you don't need to be. The other piece, particularly in smaller organizations, it's what I call, or what people say, it's getting what's in your head onto paper or documented somehow. There's a lot of knowledge people have about how the business operates. And let's say, for example, that information would help write out a work instruction or help write out a procedure. How do we do this? Because, you know, I talk with business owners who say, I'm getting so far down into the weeds, right? But I want to hand it off to one of my staff, but I've got it all up in my head. I need to explain to them. By the time I explain to them, I might as well do it myself. But there's no value add in that. It's a very expensive person, resource-wise, doing work in the organization that it just doesn't make sense for them to be doing. It would make much more sense if you could get what's in your head onto paper. So this aspect of, you know, thinking from an HR perspective, if you're starting to get into sort of more stabilized process, you know, repetitive task, and you feel comfortable, get it out of your head and onto paper. Write down what the steps are. If you're still developing it, clearly that could keep changing. And the reality is, even if you do get it down on paper, what the steps are in a particular task or activity, that could be a living document. If the business changes again over time, you may need to go back and revisit it, but at least you get something down on paper to help with what could be that onboarding, what could be that training, you know, helping that person get up to speed. And more importantly, delegating and pushing the work out where it makes sense for that work to reside with what resource. And there's a whole cost component to this as well, right? Knowing when to let go and being prepared to manage the hiccups. So these conversations are, and it's really interesting, you know, you talk with a business and they're clearly talking about the pain of, you know, I'm having to do all of this stuff. I know I need to delegate, but, you know, I don't know that I'm ready to delegate. And it's kind of like, fair enough. But you've got to, at some point, decide when you can let things go and be prepared when you do that. I called it managing the hiccups, right? Just be prepared that, yeah, the way you do it is great, fantastic. And somebody's going to have to come up to speed. If you have those work instructions, you do adequate training, you invest the time and energy in that. You may have less of a transition challenge if you hand that task over versus not, but it's the, you know, it's back to my doing the same thing over and expecting a different result. I mean, at some point, there's a pain point where it says you're going to have to let this go. So it's starting to think and plan around transitioning work, which typically from a startup to a growth or even rapid growth to maturity is where you start to sort of see some of those activities and planning from a people perspective. Being prepared to call it early. This is really kind of a catch-all, but I'm applying it more to the people perspective that if things are not working out, right, then as difficult as that conversation is, that may very well be a discussion that you need to have, and you need to understand what the implications are, you know, for that in terms of resourcing or staffing or impact to workload or et cetera, including the individual. But That's an interesting one. Again, I have regular conversations with clients around, especially in this area that we're in. I'm kind of doing a catch sort of, I guess, Clearview and South Georgian Bay area. Staffing and finding resources sometimes is really difficult, and getting the people. But I will say from experience and from seeing it in business, and maybe some of you have experienced it as well, not making some of those tough calls early, particularly from a potential staffing perspective, they cost a lot. Not only in work not getting done, dissatisfaction, but other employees observing somebody potentially that's not, it's having to be propped up a lot. And let's just be clear, if you've given everybody the right tools and you've given them the right training and you've set them up to be successful and we're still struggling, that's kind of the scenario I'm talking about. I'm not talking about somebody that you've just brought in. But again, you may need to sort of learn to call it early. So those are just things sort of to consider. So from a business perspective, and it plays over into the people side, and I'm going to talk through these fairly quickly because I'm sure folks are very familiar. Having a vision. I can't tell you the number of times I sit down with a business or a client and we start to talk, and I will ask the business questions, what's the vision for the business, the BP? And the reason I ask that is understanding the business helps in terms of the people management side of things, right? And so even though somebody would say, well, it's HR, but we need to understand, what is the vision for the business? What is the mid and longer term plan? What is your business plan? What are your short-term goals and objectives? Or if you have a strategic plan, how do we map that over to a people plan and strategy, which could be workforce planning? At what point are you going to need to increase staff? Are you going to have to change out skill sets? Are you introducing new technology that's going to impact resourcing? I mean, there's a lot of things from a business perspective that push over obviously into the people side. And so it's the planning component. I talk about risk assessment, I mean, that's not just from a business perspective, but from a people perspective. I mean, there are decisions that you make in the business all the time. You need to be, good at also assessing the risk for that. If I remove this work, or if I add in this technology, or if I decide to downsize or restructure, the organization or move people around, think about the impact and the consequence of that so that you can put plans in place to manage some of that risk. And the other piece, I've done a lot of work in change management in organizations, is kind of a readiness assessment, right? I mean, it's amazing, even in very large global organizations, when decisions come top down that we're going to introduce, for example, a new software system, but the organization just is not ready for it. You're going to take away structure, resource, people, and/or system and replace it, but little consideration given to training, little consideration given to impact to how the business will run, and ultimately how people will get their jobs done, which trickles into employee satisfaction, potential retention, motivation, etc. I've seen them done really well as well, and they've been able to transition to, for example, a new system, a new software. And this doesn't have to be large corporations. This could be a smaller business that you're replacing a manual process with a new system, a new automated system, right? But is the organization ready for that change? Have we done enough training? Have we communicated? Have we got the right people, et cetera, who are going to manage that? Okay, so that's kind of in your planning piece. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about those stages I mentioned earlier from a business perspective, and I guess where I would say, maybe where to focus on and when as part of that protecting your investment. So these slides that we're going to go through, and there's only the 4 of them because it'll tie back to your business life cycle slide that I showed earlier. this is really talking about at each stage in your business development, where would be areas you'd want to focus. And what I want to highlight is these slides are also, in a sense, intended to build off of one another. So, for example, when you're in a startup, and you're in the early days of the business, definitely understanding your legal obligations from an employment perspective, right? If you can take the time early on to understand your governing legislation, ESA, employment standards, human rights, health and safety. You could even have, specific to the type of work or business you have, industry standards or industry expectations. So it's really just understanding those governing legislative requirements that you have for your business, okay? And it's also around the types of employment contracts. For example, if you're a startup and it's just a couple of employees or 2 or 3 people at the moment, but the plans are that you will start to expand, starting to think about the types of employment contracts or service agreements and having thought through those, because they all have some different implication to the business and to the employment arrangement. For example, the Ministry of Labor, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with COVID, because I think the nature of work is changing generally and how people are doing work generally, but independent contractors. So if you have people working for you that are claiming they're independent and they're invoicing and you're treating them as an independent contractor, then the ministry is looking at that relationship to really test, is it genuinely an independent relationship versus a dependent relationship, okay? Because if they're independent and they're invoicing, and I know I've got some finance folks on the line here as well, then there's payroll implications and employer deductions and things and reporting and various things that you have to do. If that were to be challenged, then you would need to understand what your obligations are going to be under the working relationship with an employee and your payroll and your employer reporting and all that good stuff. So all I'm really saying here is, even though in startups there doesn't appear to be perhaps as much structure, it's a very kind of rapid, innovative, fast moving environment, there are some things to kind of think about when you're in that particular stage, because you'll build off of that. Getting a good founding and grounding in it early on will be helpful. Documentation. I can't tell you the number of times when I'm talking with businesses, and particularly in cases of dispute, et cetera, and there's no documentation. Right. And so I would say that as early in your business as you can, think about the role of documentation, right? And records retention and the security and management of information. Again, these are just things to be thinking about while you potentially have a bit of time to do some of that. Because down the road, if you're scrambling to try and build a case and pull material and documents together and you don't have that information, it obviously has an impact on your business. And if you're getting into a situation with your employee and discipline and you don't have documentation, it's a very difficult conversation that you would have. And then it's also potentially difficult if it were to be challenged. So it's early stages, start thinking about documentation and start to build that discipline around that. Job roles, even if you've got 1 or 2 people, I would certainly say, if you could focus on anything, focus on job descriptions and clear responsibilities and job expectations. And I'll add to that decision-making authority, because again, when you're in an environment in rapid growth or startup, everybody's kind of wearing multiple hats, but you can run into conflict and you can run into duplication and you can run into sort of miscommunication and misunderstanding. So if you were to focus on writing up any particular document, I would say really seriously consider those job descriptions, because when you start to have to recruit staff, They will help you in your recruitment process, right? When we think of that employee life cycle, they also help with performance management. They help with setting job expectations. They help with, so they play a broader role than just giving somebody their job description. So you get a lot of value back out of one of those. The culture, consider what type of work and culture you want to create. We call it an employee brand. Again, you start to think about, these are the types of profiles of candidates that we're looking for, people that bring these skill sets or these mindsets or these capabilities, because that's the type of business that we're going to create. And again, that will start to play out in training, development, leadership, setting expectations, managing people. So even though there's a lot of things that you're looking at when you're in a startup, from a people perspective, I would have said, understand your legal obligations, get into the good practice of documentation, because you're going to carry those forward. The same with job roles, the same with your culture. Your culture is going to evolve over time, but at least you can clarify, quantify that. Okay, moving into the growth mode. So we're bringing forward all that great stuff that we've been doing in a startup, and our business is going through a wonderful growth period. We're getting a little more stability. We're getting more profitability. We're able to reinvest. We've got money to spend. Woohoo, things are good. So basically we're into growth. Now we're starting to look at our workforce planning. Okay, so this is where, going back to those job descriptions, going back to your culture, going back to the employee life cycle model that I showed before, recruitment and onboarding, the language that you use, you need to start thinking about workforce planning. And you're hiring for the work or the workload that needs to be managed. We're back into that question, goes back to our legal piece around the type of staffing. Are they permanent? Are they temporary? Are they contracts? And the other piece that I would say here, talking to businesses, is almost start to get into what I would call a constant recruitment mode, right? To reduce in hiring delays. And what I mean by that is, you might be hiring for 2 positions, but you get 5 really good candidates. You've taken your 2, you've got your other 3, and try and build out a way to what I would call keeping these folks warm. Because depending on how rapid your growth is, it's never a bad thing to be able to come back and say, look, you talked to us 3 months ago, 6 months ago. I've done that in businesses. I've seen that happen. If it's possible, it will help reduce some of that potential hiring delay. But workforce planning starts to be an area of activity. Onboarding, again, because we're bringing people into the business. So think about a new hire checklist. Think about how long it's going to take you to train somebody. We go back to job descriptions. We go back to work instructions, which is sort of the next step on here. They're not in any particular order necessarily on this diagram, but you're starting to get into how can you help somebody who's new into the business get up to speed as quickly as possible. Because again, you got to look at the money that you've spent on recruiting, the time to train. You want that person to start contributing to your business as quickly as is reasonable. Think about an onboarding buddy, right? Depending on the nature of the job, it could take a few weeks to get somebody up to speed. It could take them several months to get them up to speed. So you just need to look at the work, look at the nature of the job, and figure out the best way that you could help that person get up to speed. But definitely look at your onboarding practices. It will help with that early employee engagement. It helps with that motivation. It helps with building that culture. It pays back. People feel like they are part of something. They're being nurtured. They're being cared for and managed. Work process, talked about that briefly. This is where you want to start getting the what's in your head onto paper piece. Start documenting work procedures and policies. Those can also be used as part of your onboarding. If somebody starts with you, maybe the first day they just sit and read the how-to manual, right? And so really it's starting to build some structure and creating some stability within your business. And obviously that plays over into your people management practices. And then leadership. This is where you might be at that tipping point of where you need to delegate, right? We've come out of the rapid startup. I can't do everything myself. I've got to start delegating. I've got to start creating roles that will have responsibility for leading key work stream areas, key process areas, or key business tasks. And basically, it starts also to hold people accountable. It starts to build out that organizational design. It starts to play into your performance management process. And I talk here about a degree of risk taking. There's a really simple tool. I was sharing it with a client the other week because this very often comes up in the conversation as well, is around, well, what's my degree of decision making authority, right? And so what we mean by that is, what decisions can I make independently? What decisions do I need to come back and speak with another person that has a degree of decision making or authority above mine? Or what decisions do I really need to run right up to the top, or the person with the key decision making? So we call it the ABC. There's lots of different tools, but that's the simplest one I've seen. So you're starting to create that degree of structure, that degree of autonomy, that degree of ownership for people in a growth business. So maturity. So these are businesses, again, we're building on this, right? They've got good process in place. They're very well established in the market. You know, they have a clear brand identity. They're hitting their targets. You know, they're having a degree of profitability. You know, they're meeting their BPs. So they're organizations that will now start to look at what we call, in the talent development area, building a talent pipeline. The organization has started to grow and develop, that you can start to talk to people about career paths. What's it going to take for me to become, I'll make it up, a director of quality? Well, you're going to have to spend some time in this position, in this position, in this position. So your talent development conversations start to happen. And again, the reason I have it in here versus growth or startup is, you're probably not there yet as a business. It doesn't mean you can't be thinking about it, but in practical terms, when you've got everything on your plate, this is something to be aware of and start to think about, but you're probably not at that point versus when you get into the next stage from a maturity perspective. Cross training and promotion. So this is also going to play into employee engagement and retention strategies, right? People want to know, where am I going next? Employee engagement, hopefully all the way through this, you've been developing good communications with employees and information sharing. But in organizations, they usually have very well managed communication strategies, communication forums, communication plans for employees, for information sharing. And also, when we talk about employee engagement, it's the feedback, you know, it's the reward and recognition components of your compensation. I haven't necessarily talked about the compensation piece at this point, but when you're thinking about employee engagement in a mature business, you've invested, again, think about that person. You've invested maybe by this time 3 to 5 years, right, with that individual. So you want to make sure that you're protecting that investment, right? You're keeping employees engaged, you're keeping them motivated, you're giving them a reason to stay within the organization, right? Either through development and opportunity, reward and recognition, good communications. Businesses in this area, and again, I've worked particularly in the automotive, the manufacturing businesses, the continuous improvement. So a lot of these really good business systems that you've been developing over time, businesses in the maturity sort of span tend to be also looking at, okay, so how do we continue to improve? We've got a good system, either through process, through systems, through automation, through innovation, right? Because of typically where they are on potential profitability, the market space they're in, how long their brands have been at. They're looking at ways to make sure that they can keep that level of profitability. So from a skill set perspective and from a cultural perspective, organizations do spend time in this space of continuous improvement, right? And that can be everybody in the organization can contribute to that. Particularly if you get into automation, now you might also be having to have the conversations around, we could be eliminating an entire part of the business from a workforce perspective because we don't necessarily need that work to be done manually. That work can now be done through automation, but I've got all these great resources can I redeploy? Can I retrain? Can I reassign type work? So there's a lot more organizational design kind of shuffling that starts to go on at this level. And leadership, again, we've continued to develop that leadership. We started with the delegation piece, and now we're getting into those, the what and the how part of performance, which is what somebody needs to do is just as important as how they're doing it. So if I hit all my sales targets, but I totally upset my customers, okay, I hit my sales target, but I'm not going to be able to go back to that customer. So it's starting to send those messages and working with people on kind of the whole picture around performance and performance management and holding people accountable to that. And the last stage here, around renewal and decline, again, businesses in this space, they could be going through there's new technology, there's changes in our market space, there's competitive landscape changes, new competitors in our space. We've got to rethink how we do our business. So we're in this kind of renewal phase, or we could be in a part of the industry that is becoming obsolete, right? New technologies come in, you just think in your own lives, things that you use. Well, there used to be companies that made, CDs and CD players and things like that. And we don't use that anymore. We live stream and right. So what happens? We've got to think about what we're doing to reinvent or, get into a new space. So from an organizational perspective, again, you've got to think about this person that's been in your business, that you want to retain. You don't want to lose this staff. There's a lot invested. They've invested a lot. So strategies to retain staff. The other thing too is when companies start to go into the decline mode or people see a lot of new things coming down the pipeline, they may have a tendency to want to exit the organization before you would want them to or need them to. And so the retention piece starts to become kind of a key area of focus. And this is where looking at your compensation plans, not just your base salaries, but things like long-term incentives, managing the risk around regrettable losses. So hopefully, I don't think there's anybody on the call at this point that may be in that phase. But, again, when you think about, your business over time, and this could be well down the road, these are things, the idea is to start thinking a little bit ahead so you can get ahead of it. Innovation, you're still looking at employee, to drive change, innovate, reinvention. You could be looking at new skills and capabilities. I mean, some of these businesses, I use Kodak as the example, there was a whole technology there that basically got knocked out of the market. You have all these resources with skills that potentially are obsolete. So, I know when I've worked in businesses in the past from a training perspective is knowing what's happening in your market space, knowing what's happening with technology, knowing what's happening with, if it's a consumer influence, are there new skills? Should we be looking at things now? Because it's going to take us. I had a customer service group when I was working in the States. We wanted to switch what we would call order taking, which is largely what our customer service team did, because we brought in technology that allowed the customer to go online and do their own order management. So we didn't need a team of people to do order taking. And they did more than that. I don't want to downsize, but we needed them to do more what we would call account analytics, which means they needed a different skill set to be able to start looking at the customer accounts and being able to sell, upsell, etc. So, it's not that we necessarily get rid of people. It's just if we know this is coming down the pipeline and it goes back to the planning, it goes back to your business plan and your strat plan from a people planning perspective, should I be looking at new skill sets that I need to start investing to make sure that my employees stay current? And then managing employee communications, again, leadership here plays a critical role. They're managing maybe higher anxiety levels. They may need to make some of the tougher calls around the organization and the structure. So there's sort of still a lot going on, even if the business is kind of in this decline or renewal phase. So what I've tried to do here is illustrate that as your business goes through these different phases of development, you will build on, right, each phase into the next one. But there are areas that you will probably start or need to focus more. or start to focus if you haven't had to focus on it, previously within the business. So there's sort of a lot of information in there. But I kind of put a few of what I would call key takeaways, and I'll just finish up with this. So consider what's going to trigger the need to move from one stage of the business development to another in your business, whether it's a financial trigger, a volume, or a workload, and what's the people impact of these changes? Is this a point where you need to start hiring? Is this a point where you need to start delegating? Is this a point where you need to start rethinking roles and responsibilities? And I crossed out, what are you able and willing to do? Because of course, people are able to do pretty much anything. I find a lot of the conversation is what you're willing to do, right? So it's that mindset of what are you willing to do because it makes sense, versus where you might want to start thinking about even outsourcing some of the work or some of the activities in your business, depending on where your business is, depending on when your organization is. Plan earlier than you think you need to. So even though I've showed you these stages, I mean, really, if you can get ahead of the curve, especially, for example, in recruiting, if you have a vacancy, it could take you 3 or 4 months to find the right person. In the meantime, if that position sits vacant, things are not getting done, they're being redistributed, etc. So that's just one example. It could be other areas, but that's sort of the easiest one to use it in the context. Be aware of what's happening in your market. So new skill sets, new technology, things that might change what you need to think at from a people perspective in your business. And then the one final takeaway that I've always, early in my career, somebody had said it to me, and I just think it's such a powerful statement, is that people are one of the assets in your business that appreciate over time, right? So if you think about it, any other asset, typically you either consume or it depreciates over time. People are, you bring in that new hire, let's say they're straight out of university or college, they're pretty green, you invest time, effort, and energy, as do they become a potential very valuable asset to your business. And so, if you think of people in the context a little bit of sort of an asset to your business, then what do you do to protect that? And this is where some of those things I've talked about around clear expectations, job descriptions, decision-making authority, support from leadership, retention strategies, communication, and plan to protect that investment. And that's really, I think, everybody knows that's the case, but it's interesting when you have, conversations sometimes in business and they go, well, we lost, Mary Beth, and that's a regrettable loss. That person had a lot of information, skill set, et cetera, which will be difficult to find again. And, so how are you protecting even sometimes a critical asset, people-wise, in your business? And that is my time. So I shared an awful lot, and I know we probably don't have a ton of time for questions, but I'm certainly happy to take any or anything that we didn't cover you maybe wanted to put on the table. Anybody had anything? And if not, the other thing I think I'd said to Kelly, I don't know, Rebecca, if I'd shared that with you, is I'm also happy if people want to reach out after, or you get people after the fact that might see this online, to give me a shout, and we can have that conversation. I'm happy to chat further. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I actually have a few questions, and I'm okay to touch base at another time too,
Sure.
as opposed to keep going on the call. I was wondering, so I personally work in home healthcare services.
Yep.
And I am always looking, I appreciated what you said about ongoing hiring or
Yep.
continual, that is something that's just what my whole world is about.
Yeah.
But it is really hard to find good folks.
Yes.
And sometimes I wonder, maybe I'm not asking the right questions to get, to especially now, because I'm not seeing people in person. I'm doing these kind of phone screen type calls, and then maybe meeting them on Zoom. And the nature of the work is that I might need to hire them in 2 days, like because I have a client who's suddenly onboarded and I need. So at some point, maybe we could touch base a little bit about what those questions need to be, or even get some quick thoughts now about, like, I don't know, are there some questions that you feel like you can't not ask, because
So I mean, basically, in terms of getting to, I guess the question is, what is it you really need in somebody in that job, right? From either a skills or a capability perspective or experience, and tailoring your questions to be able to get a good sense of whether that person would bring that to the table. So, that's kind of stating the obvious, but I mean, the challenge would be, I would, sorry, let me rethink that. I would say it might be interesting to just, do you ever get any feedback as to why somebody left, didn't make the, or they didn't make the cut? I mean, is there any other information that you've got? Because that may point to what may not be getting raised in the course of the interview, or, and I think when you say healthcare, are these PSW or that type of work?
Yeah, or even companion care. So it's sort of like a non-skilled even position, right? Like really, sometimes it's just, are they a nice person? Can they interact with someone? Are they comfortable enough in themselves to communicate well? Can they just start up a conversation with a stranger? Because some of this is around keeping someone company for 3 hours. So that is hard. Can be, I think, hard to evaluate on a phone call or on, like a quick meeting.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the questions that you ask, we can take a look at kind of the questions that you ask. And, I don't know the background for these people, and we can take this offline as well. In terms of, are these people that are in this space? So is there a history? Is there referencing? Can you get any, it may be the reference component and the feedback from previous clients is a critical, piece to this as well, right? In terms of, am I getting the right person? I'm sure you're doing all of those things. So maybe if we take it offline, we can do a little bit of
maybe just a bit of unpacking. It might be helpful for sure.
No, that for sure, absolutely. It's a challenge though, right? Getting somebody that's going to fit with a client.
Yeah, a lot of my work and what we sort of pride ourselves on is this like matching.
Yes.
And it's interesting. That's the best way I can put it. It's interesting, challenging. It's good. Like, I like a challenge, but
yeah.
Nicole, what are you thinking?
Do you ever do any like questionnaires of case scenarios? Here's the situation, and just like make random things up just based on what you've seen in the past, and see how they respond, like how they would handle the situation?
Oh, that's a great idea. You know what? I could probably, I think, especially in this like online kind of world that I have to work in now to do this, that could work really well. That's a fantastic suggestion. Thank you. Yeah, I'll try that. I think I could actually build those scenarios fairly easily.
Yeah, because definitely past behavior hopefully predicts future performance, right?
Yeah.
So if they've done it, great.
Okay, that's a great thought.
Google Forms, because then you're going to keep your responses in there as well, right? So if you're looking for a specific skill set, then you can export all your responses into an Excel worksheet or something and sort based on criteria. And kind of, if you're looking for someone in a pinch, then you've kind of got some access to that. But I would really put some thought into those case scenario questions.
Yeah.
I really like that idea. I think I could probably, I think I can do something with that for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Mandy, did you have any questions, any thoughts tonight?
I'm just trying to absorb everything.
Yeah, it's probably a lot.
Wendy, this was an amazing presentation. You were super thorough. I got a few little nuggets that I was like, oh, I'm going to tuck that in my pocket.
Well, see, there it is. If there's one or two nuggets, again, not knowing everybody's business, then that's great. And I'm happy to, if something triggers, after the fact and it comes up, then by all means, just shoot me a message.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks
right.
again for your time.
Thanks very much, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so
Bye.
much.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.